Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha back with another Grim Dawn class examination. Now, this is going to be the Battlemage, so if you've seen my walkthrough, you'll already be familiar with some of this, but I'm going to take a general view of rather specific build types, which again I did talk about to some extent in the walkthrough, but this is going to be removed from the context of a first character and just apply broadly to any and all characters that you possibly could be building. Now, this is another one of those combinations that at first glance isn't really going to mesh well together, and to some extent that will hold true throughout. But, as I have stated before, one excellent skill that you should always at least give some consideration into building is Alexa's Flash Freeze, with possibly Absolute Zero. Whether or not you consider Absolute Zero depends on whether or not you intend on doing a physical build. See, with this particular combination, Absolute Zero allows even the physical side of your soldier abilities to deal increased damage. Again, considering Alexa's Flash Freeze doesn't freeze most bosses and a decent amount of heroes, there is a mild problem there. It's really intended for crowd control, which generally is where you should be using it anyways. So, there was a commenter that said, you can't freeze a lot of bosses, and that is absolutely true. A lot of bosses are completely immune to freezing, which is fine because it's not the intention of Alexa's Flash Freeze at all. That's just not its point. If you wanted single target cold damage, you go with Trozan's Sky Shard. But the main draw of using Alexa's Flash Freeze with the soldier physical build is primarily in, first off, providing just a bit more damage diversity. By itself, the soldier class has physical, pierce, and bleeding damage, and usually, if an enemy is going to be resistant to physical damage, they're probably also going to be relatively resistant to bleeding and or piercing. They usually have some resistance to all three damage types at the same time, in varying amounts depending on the enemy. If they're relatively resistant to one of the three, they'll probably be resistant to the other two. So having some cold damage splashed in there is not a bad thing. Again, the exception here is to bosses, but considering the other abilities you'll have access to, that's not really a huge problem. And even if you're not going with a physical build, Alexa's Flash Freeze, whether or not you include Absolute Zero in this is up to you, but Alexa's Flash Freeze itself gives increased fire resistance. So if you're going with a reckless power build, your fire damage from Kalidor's Tempest, or if you're going for Albrecht's Aether Ray / Devastation, both can benefit from Alexa's Flash Freeze. And if you're going with a cold lightning damage, obviously you can go right into Absolute Zero. If you're going with Star Pact, a Star Pact build, then it's not necessarily a bad idea to either go into Kalidor's Tempest or possibly go into Inferno. Possibly. Alternatively, you could go into, with Star Pact, you could go into Albrecht's Aether Ray, which does Aether, Fire, and Lightning. Now, the reason why you actually want to possibly include some Aether in here is because Star Pact converts Aether damage to cold damage. Now, the Fire damage itself from any of these three abilities, be it Devastation, be it Albrecht's Aether Ray, or Kalidor's Tempest, all three of these do Aether and Fire damage. The Fire damage is being boosted by Alexa's Flash Freeze, and with Star Pact converting that Aether damage to cold damage and then boosting it after the fact, that's not a bad time. Now, the one thing I would state is that if you are going with a Star Pact build, maybe not necessarily go into Devastation. I know it's powerful, but it doesn't offer the lightning damage that either Inferno offers, nor does it offer the lightning damage that Disintegration offers. So, if you are going with Star Pact, I would lean a little bit more towards Disintegration or Inferno. That's just me. You could also splash some physical damage in here very, very easily. Usually, if I'm going to be splashing physical damage into a Star Pact build, I'm going to be busting out Blitz, because using Blitz, you can actually kind of zip over to potentially more dangerous targets or potentially bigger threats like the healer of the enemy group or their range, or possibly you can single out the hero or boss and then use your Absolute Zero to freeze the surrounding enemies and just, blitz around and whack them that way. but I'm going to usually use Blitz. If you're going with a physical heavy build and you only want Alexa's Flash Freeze for the physical reduction, then very often you're going to pass over Force Wave. Now, if you happen to have a piece of equipment that increases Force Wave, that's totally fine. Go for it. But usually I'll go with Blitz and or Blade Arc with Laceration. That also works very well with Alexa's Flash Freeze. You wait until the enemies are surrounding you, you freeze them, and then you absolutely lacerate them into oblivion. It works very well. If the enemy has ranged, you simply Blitz first, freeze, Laceration. Blitz has a really nice 3.5 second recharge, so by the time you've finished your Laceration, your Blitz should be pretty close to back up, and you can go back to that group that was originally going to surround you. So that can work very well. But again, if you are going with a Star Pact, give some thought to Disintegration or to Inferno. The Aether damage that these do will be converted to cold. The fire damage can be boosted by Alexras. It's a pretty good time. Something else I would like to also warn you about is that Shattered Star only gives you a chance of lightning damage, or a chance of increased lightning damage. Without that, it does some basic lightning damage here. It does boost the lightning damage of this, but if you only want to splash in the cold and lightning, you can skip Shattered Star, but if you're going with a full cold lightning build, you do need Shattered Star. The only real ability, and this carries over from the Necromancer Arcanist, is Fabric of Reality is pretty useless here, because again, neither of these two really do chaos damage. The technical exception to this is if you wanted to go into Tainted Power, but that converts the Aether damage into chaos damage, so again, there's not really a point. Now, you may have noticed that there's basically three broad types of damage you can really bust out here. You can go into the Star Pact is technically the most versatile because it not only boosts absolute zero, but it sets up for you to use at least one other ability of a damage type that is not cold or lightning, which is hugely important. I'm running through a walkthrough right now with a Demolitionist Occultist who has a really hard time with chthonic enemies, and pretty much anything that resists fire at this point in time. So you don't want to over-rely on any single damage type, and I've been saying this a lot along the way. And this is, I'm actually going to go off on a brief tangent here, so be prepared. This is my essential problem with a lot of full builds, as they're called, that people recommend. These are the builds where they have written down in an extremely specific way, okay, you hit this level, you need to put your points into these skills, and you need to be wearing this equipment. I'm not a big fan of that. I think, for me personally, that takes away from the joy of playing this game, which is exploring around and experimenting with new things and trying out new things all the time, and generally just figuring out what does and does not work, and just having no full locked-in build. I usually do restrict myself with my 3-rule system, but that's only to keep me on track in a specific build type. Otherwise, as my full improv walkthrough demonstrates, you can very rapidly run out of iron bits, even with rules, even with those rules in place. Without them, I would be flipping around my build all over the place, and obviously no one character is going to have the resources to sustain that kind of thing until you've wandered through the Shattered Realm 1,200 times. So, I do usually set 3 rules, but these full builds don't. They have every move, every point, every attribute, every piece of equipment, in most cases, planned down to the exact point in time you need to be doing them, basically. Okay, you're level 30. You need to have these pieces of equipment on, you need to have this many points in these skills and in these classes, and you need to have your attribute points distributed to these specific attributes. But the problem with a lot of these builds is that they focus on 1, possibly 2 damage types. Now, 2 damage types can get you through the game, but there are going to be moments, if you have the wrong combination of damage types, where this is a problem. And again, I'm going to use my character named Demon in my second walkthrough as a demonstration of this. Primarily, that is what is known as a directed build, where I go with a rough theme between the 2 classes. And the rough theme of Demon, and I mentioned this at the beginning of that walkthrough, is that this theme would be Fire and Chaos, which automatically was going to make any battle against chthonic enemies very difficult for that character, just by dint of the fact that a large amount of chthonic enemies are very resistant to both Fire and Chaos. I have actually had to make an adjustment in that walkthrough to dropping the Hellhound that I was originally building and switching to Dreek's Evil Eye for the poison acid damage that is not as heavily resisted by chthonic enemies. But that's an example. I needed a third damage type, at least for the short term, for that character, and a lot of full builds will encounter this problem. Now, there are ways around this. There are resistant reductions and such things, and a lot of full builds emphasize a need for resistance reductions. But frankly, you don't need resistance reductions as much. There are certain enemies that still do. Most of the certain bosses still require, well, you still really want resistance reductions. You don't need them a lot of the time, but they're nice to have. But a lot of full builds are like, yeah, you need this particular whatever, so you can reduce the enemy's resistances to your chosen damage type or two. But with a lot of the builds that I've been talking about, well, a lot of the class examinations I try to talk about as many different ways you can splash a little bit of damage of other kinds in there. For example, with the Star Pact build, if you were to go absolutely full in on cold and lightning damage, and you weren't going for a retaliation build, you have 72 points left. Just going absolutely full cold lightning. Just the cold lightning stuff. Now let's say, for kicks, we'll go with Albrecht's Aether Ray, okay? Splash that in there for some nifty little fire damage, a little bit of Aether damage, and even more cold and lightning damage. Okay, so now we could grab Cadence for boss fights, if we really wanted to. We could go all the way up, we could go all the way up to Fighting Form. Pull out some of these points. We could go all the way to Deadly Momentum if we really wanted to. Heck, we could go with Blitz. We could slap in Blitz in there, and Menhir's Will, if we really wanted to. We could, if you were really desperate, you could pull 10 points out of here, go into Military Conditioning for extra health. You could do that. Heck, pull back another 8, you can get most of shield training too, if you really absolutely wanted that, or even Decorated Soldier if you wanted to dedicate yourself to a little bit more physical damage. And at this point you probably wouldn't want to, but as an example, you could easily incorporate some really nice damage types in here, or if you really wanted to, you could take these points, pull out all of these points, go into Iskandras, increase the fire, lightning, and cold damage you're doing, and you could go in that direction and then slap some points into Inner Focus. So you can, Star Pact is the most versatile of the broad build types that you can do with this combination. In terms of sheer damage output, you have a lot of different options for getting around resistances rather than straight up having to reduce them. You do have, obviously, resistance reduction because it's always a good thing, but if you come up against an enemy that you cannot freeze, then at the very least you have other damage types with which you can deal with that threat. Splash a little bit of physical in there, splash a little bit of fire in there, what have you. Reckless Power rough builds are not quite as versatile, but they do offer, you'll notice the fire retaliation there, as opposed to the complete lack of retaliation in Star Pact. Reckless Power does give you the unique ability to potentially slap down fools with a sweet retaliation build. You could go into Mirror of Arioctes, you could go into Counter-Strike, obviously. It's more of a hybridized version because you still will want to be building something along the lines of Inferno or Disintegration still. You could go, if you wanted to, Iskander's Elemental Exchange and Panetti's Replicating Missile all the way at the end here. That's very powerful, does lots of Aether and fire damage. So there is that particular possibility. So there is some leeway there. You could go Cadence into Discord if you wanted to go with the Elemental setup. You have a lot of different interesting options here. And again, I want to actually talk about this. Just like with the Blade Master, the Battlemage is probably not going to be looking to use field command or squad tactics. Again, you don't have pets. If you're playing multiplayer with friends who do, maybe it's worth it. Probably not still, but maybe. So, those are a lot of nice options there, and of course, as always, the great strength of the soldier class is that you can always just pull the passives out of the soldier, leave the actives behind, and just use the actives of the other class. That is totally viable. You can absolutely do that. But there are, like I said, there are always those couple of skills that you should always at least consider. And for this combination, I've already discussed Alexa's Flash Freeze and Absolute Zero. This should always be considered in any build you play. Even with the Reckless Power build, you want to do that extra fire damage? Just go into Alexa's Flash Freeze. You have a soldier physical build, you want to do a little bit more? Absolutely go into Absolute Zero. No problem. There is no build that this combination can generate that Alexa's Flash Freeze, with or without Absolute Zero, cannot fit effectively into. Another one is Cadence. No matter what build you're running, Cadence, with or without Discord, is an excellent contribution, even just the first one. The third thing I would pretty much say you would always want to at least consider utilizing in this combination is Iskandra's Elemental Exchange. You can boost the Cadence if you really wanted to. You can boost all of the damage here. Yes, some of this does ethereal damage, but the rest of this is elemental. This does fire and lightning. This will do fire and lightning, this does cold and lightning, this does pure cold, this does elemental damage in general, it eventually picks up some extra fire and some electrocution damage, which is also boosted by Iskandra's Elemental Exchange. And you can absolutely... I'm not listing these three skills as skills you must have in every build. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is these are three skills you should at least consider incorporating into your build, even if they did not occur to you as viable options at the time. That's all I'm saying. That these three skills, regardless of what your build is, can be fitted into your build, no matter what. If you were interested. So, ultimately, that's all I'm going to say on the individual skills and definite ways you can build. Again, you could absolutely go with the full physical with Oleron's Rage, or you could go full retail with Menhir's Bulwark. But another thing I actually wanted to talk a hot minute about is simply the incredible capacity for this class to survive. Now, it's S level on the tier list for defensiveness, and I explained some of why in that video, but essentially, besides the massive boosts in defense and health and self-healing that these down here provide, and Menhir's Bulwark, essentially it comes down to the sheer diversity of ways you can crowd control. I can blow you away with Wrath of Agrivix, I can freeze you, I can rain projectiles down you and stand there, basically, and eat whatever. Maven's Sphere. Nullification, which is surprisingly useful against certain enemies. You have all these different methods of controlling crowds and getting through any fight you need to. And that's really why there's such a big contrast between my current character and the Taken, the Lost Taken. The Taken had access to enough diverse damage types that, with one exception, one boss at the end of Forgotten Gods, where I had rather arrogantly consolidated almost all of my damage into Cold and Lightning at that point, but throughout most of that walkthrough, the Taken is able to deal some form of damage that can get around at least a good enough portion of the enemy's defense to deal respectable damage, and the combination I'm playing does not really have that, and I was aware of that when I decided upon this combination, but I wanted to exemplify that. But this particular build is always a good time. because there's so many different things you can do with it, and it works. If you want to do substantial damage and remain tanky, this is how you do it. Now, this is not obviously, this is obviously not the most damaging of builds that you can go with, but you'll survive, you'll deal out very respectable damage, and if you're working with other players, Alexa's Flash Freeze, plus potentially Absolute Zero, plus a Scunder's Elemental Exchange with Manifestation, are absolutely lovely. You could even go further full support and go into Field Command. But there are a lot of ways, just by playing this combination perfectly normally, that you can benefit a lot of your allies if you have them. So those are my thoughts on the Soldier Arcanist combination. Thank you all very much for joining me, and if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, what have you, please leave them down in the comments below. I do read them. Thank you all very much, and have a great 24 hours.